Welcome to this exploration of one of the most unsettling instances in Ozark Mountain history. Please let me know where you're watching from and what time you're listening to this narration in the comments section before we start. What locations and what hours of the day or night these recorded accounts reach are of interest to us. There's a story in the Ozark Mountains' thick forests, where the mist clings to the old trees like ghostly fingers, a story that has been purposefully left out of most historical accounts. It was 1776, the year of revolution and the founding of a nation. However, in the isolated wilderness of what would eventually become Missouri and Arkansas, a different kind of gloom was developing as the eastern seaboard was engulfed in conflict. Land registration records from colonial Virginia contain the Pruitt family's earliest known mention. Born in 1734 to English immigrants, Nathaniel Pruitt was a well-known carpenter and a modestly wealthy farmer. His 1756 marriage to Sarah Blackwood was noted in a small church outside of Williamsburg's parish registry. They had 5 children during their nearly 2 decades of living on a small farm, according to tax records. Thomas, born in 1758, Elizabeth in 1761, John in 1764, Mary in 1767, and James in 1771, 1760, Catherine in 1764, Samuel in 1770, and newborn Rebecca in 1775. It is still unclear what drove the family to abandon their comfortable home and go for the perilous border. According to a partial letter found in colonial administrative documents, Nathaniel had experienced financial hardship. "The debts grow beyond my means to satisfy them," he said in an early 1775 letter to a relative. Another passage from a different letter dated November 1775 suggests another possible reason. Sarah has not been well since Rebecca's birth. The physician suggests a change of air might improve her constitution. I have heard tell of land in the Western Territories where a man might claim acreage sufficient to establish a legacy for his children. The Pruitt family's westward migration was chronicled in a number of sources, regardless of their motivations. They purchased supplies in February 1776, according to a merchant's logbook from a trading post in Kentucky. In March of the same year, a military message reported that they had passed through a frontier fort. They arrived to the western slopes of the Ozark Mountains by April 1776, when Nathaniel made a property claim for a 200-acre plot close to present-day Jasper County to a French colonial authority. According to the formal land claim, which has been maintained in territorial records, the property is a lush valley with limestone bluffs to the north. Plenty of water from a clear-running creek, large forest, and a cultivable meadow. In contrast to his previous signatures from Virginia archives, Nathaniel's signature on this document exhibits a noticeable firmness, indicating a man who was sure in his choice despite the dangers of frontier colonization. In June 1776, a passing missionary wrote in his journal that he had discovered a family newly arrived from Virginia, industriously engaged in the construction of a substantial dwelling. Mr. Pruitt has already erected a fine cabin of hewn logs, larger than most frontier habitations, with separate sleeping quarters for the parents and children, a common room of generous proportion, and a well-constructed root cellar for the storage of provisions. Moreover, the missionary wrote that the family appeared in good health and spirits, particularly Mrs. Pruitt, who seemed much recovered from an earlier indisposition. A letter Nathaniel wrote to his relative in Virginia in July 1776 confirmed this account of Sarah Pruitt's better health. The letter continues with descriptions of the land that imply Nathaniel thought he had found the new beginning his family needed. Sarah thrives in the mountain air. Her melancholy has lifted, and she tends the garden with vigor unknown since before Rebecca's birth. The children, too, flourish in this wild country. Thomas assists me in improving our claim, while the girls have established a small schoolroom in a corner of the cabin where Elizabeth teaches her younger siblings their letters. The soil yields bountifully with little encouragement. We have planted corn and beans, squash and potatoes. The forest provides ample game, and the stream that passes near our door teems with fish. We want for nothing that honest labor cannot provide. The Pruitt family's initial months in the Ozarks are depicted in these written narratives as a period of hope and rejuvenation, which heightens the unease of what transpired. A fragment of what looks to be Nathaniel's personal journal, found in 1952 by historian Arthur Fleming in the custody of a private antiques dealer in Philadelphia, is the first sign of trouble. In contrast to his previous correspondence, the item dated September 18, 1776, shows a clear shift in tone. Thomas discovered a peculiar opening in the limestone bluff behind the house today. It appears to be a natural cave entrance, partially obscured by fallen rock. The boy was eager to explore, but something about the darkness beyond the entrance filled me with unease. I forbade him to enter without my accompaniment, though I have no immediate intention of exploring the passage. Sarah says I am being superstitious, but I cannot shake the feeling that some things are best left undisturbed. The first reference to what would turn out to be a recurrent theme in the Pruitt mystery is in a later entry dated September 30th. The sound began 3 nights ago, a low, rhythmic pulsing that seems to emanate from the direction of the cave. Sarah cannot hear it, nor can the younger children, but Thomas confessed this morning that it has been keeping him awake. He described it as like a heartbeat, but not quite right. I told him it was merely the wind moving through the rock formations, but I do not believe this myself. An escalation is indicated by the subsequent preserved entry, dated October 12, 1776. Thomas's fascination with the cave entrance grows troubling. Twice this week I have found him standing before it at dawn, as if he had been there all night. When questioned, he claims no memory of leaving his bed. Yesterday, I found markings scratched into the ground before the entrance, symbols I do not recognize, arranged in a circular pattern. Thomas denies creating them, and indeed, they do not seem like the work of a boy. I have covered them with stones and told the children to keep away from the bluff entirely. The diary entries indicate that things were fast getting worse by the end of October. The 24th of October in 1776. Elizabeth now speaks of hearing the sounds as well. She describes them differently than Thomas. Voices singing without words, she says. I have caught her watching her brother when she thinks no one observes her. Something passes between them, some understanding I am not privy to. Sarah suggests it is merely the natural alliance of siblings, but I perceive something more troubling in their silent communications. The 27th of October in 1776. Found Catherine standing before the hearth at midnight, staring into the flames without blinking. When I touched her shoulder, she turned to me with an expression I can only describe as hunger, though not for food. She spoke a sentence in a language unknown to me, her voice deeper than should be possible for a child of 12. When I pressed her about it in the morning, she had no recollection of the event. On November 3, 1776, the markings have reappeared, not only before the cave entrance but now etched into the wood of our dwelling, behind furniture, beneath rugs, in the corners of rooms. I have not caught anyone in the act of creating these symbols, yet they multiply daily. Sarah finally admits that something is amiss, but attributes it to some fever or frontier madness. I am not convinced that the explanation is so mundane. The entry that is most disturbing is dated November 12th. The sound has returned, louder than before. Sarah insists it is merely the wind in the rock formations, but I know better. It comes from beneath. The children hear it too, though they no longer speak of it. Thomas watches the floor at night. Found him sleeping in the root cellar again this morning. Says he hears his name being called. A week later, on the 20th of November, Nathaniel wrote, "Sarah found marks on the children this morning, like small burns on their shoulders and backs. She accuses me of discipline I did not administer. The marks form patterns I cannot comprehend. Elizabeth can now recite passages of Scripture she has never been taught. When asked how she knows these words, she only smiles. Her teeth seem different somehow." The last entry in the journal, which was written on December 2nd, reads as follows: "I have found what lies beneath the root cellar. God forgive me for bringing my family to this place. They are in the walls now. They speak with borrowed tongues. I have failed to protect them from what was waiting here long before we arrived. The French trader comes in 5 days. Perhaps there is still time." French fur merchant Jean-Baptiste Duval visited the region in early December, according to this final entry, which is consistent with historical sources. The first external record of the event that would baffle scholars for centuries was his description of what he discovered at the Pruitt homestead. The following entry, dated December 7th, 1776, was made in Duval's original ledger, which is now housed in the Missouri Historical Society's collection, but was kept secret until 1968. Arrived at the homestead of the Englishman Pruitt near midday. The cabin appeared in good order, with smoke rising from the chimney and no outward sign of distress. Upon approaching, however, I observed an unnatural stillness. No movement within or without, no sound of human activity or animal husbandry. The door stood partially open. Within, I discovered a scene unnatural in its perfection, as if the family had simply turned to vapor while going about their daily tasks. A meal laid upon the table, still warm. 5 places set, though the family numbered 7. Garments folded neatly upon chairs. The hearth fire burning low, but not extinguished. Most peculiar was the family Bible, laid open upon the table. Certain passages in the book of Judges marked with a substance that appeared to be blood. I shall not transcribe the verses here, for they disturb my thoughts even now, though they were familiar texts. I called for the family, searching the sleeping quarters and the surroundings of the cabin, but found no sign of recent human passage. No tracks in the soft earth save my own, though a light snow had fallen the previous night and should have preserved any evidence of departure. I confess I experienced a profound dread, unlike any I have known in 20 years of frontier travel. Though no threat presented itself, I felt observed from all directions, as if the very walls of the cabin held eyes. In the root cellar I discovered, "Here, several lines of text have been deliberately obscured by what appears to be ink. I shall not speak further of what I found there. Some things are best left undocumented, lest they take root in one's dreams. I departed with haste, traveling through the night despite the dangers. So great was my desire to put distance between myself and that place. I shall report the disappearance to the colonial administrator at Fort Charlesworth, though I doubt any action will result given the remoteness of the location and the present military concerns." It appears that Duval did disclose his findings, as evidenced by a follow-up note in his ledger dated December 10th. The administrator has dispatched 3 militiamen to investigate the Pruitt homestead. I declined to accompany them despite the offered compensation. No sum would induce me to return to that valley. I provided detailed directions and advised them to exercise extreme caution, particularly regarding the root cellar. I fear my warnings were received with skepticism. 3 militiamen, Corporal James Harlow, Private William Scherer, and Private Thomas Jenkins, were sent to investigate the Pruitt homestead on December 12, 1776, according to colonial administrative records. There isn't a formal report of their findings among the records that have survived. The duty roster dated January 20th, 1777, contains a brief note that is more telling. Harlow, Scherer, and Jenkins to be listed as deserted, their accounts forfeit. This classification goes against the then standard military practice, which would normally list men who did not return from an official mission as missing rather than deserted. Claude Fontaine, the colonial administrator who had commissioned the inquiry, became aware of this disparity. His personal correspondence, discovered during a 1964 archival project at Washington University, included a letter to his superior dated January 25, 1777. I must express grave concern regarding the Pruitt matter. The men dispatched to investigate have not returned, nor has any communication from them been received. This marks the disappearance of an entire family of 7, followed by 3 militiamen sent to determine their fate. I have interviewed the trader Duval again and found him reluctant to elaborate on his initial report. He exhibits signs of acute distress when pressed for details, particularly regarding what he observed in the root cellar of the homestead. I propose a larger expedition, properly armed, to determine what has occurred. While frontier disappearances are not uncommon, the circumstances as described by Duval suggest something beyond the usual dangers of Indian hostility or natural calamity. Furthermore, the proximity of the Pruitt claim to the cave systems known to exist in that region raises additional concerns, given the recent discoveries made by the geological expedition led by Dr. Montrose last summer. Colonial archives show no mention of a reply to Fontaine's letter. The purpose and results of this second expedition, however, appear to have been purposefully obscured by the carefully neutral language of a military dispatch dated February 8, 1777, which states that a patrol of 6 men under the command of Lieutenant Burke investigated reported disturbances near the western limestone formations and found no evidence of recent human habitation or distress. Subsequent documents make it abundantly evident that the Pruitt homestead had been demolished by March 1777. Even in cases of abandonment or death, frontier land claims usually remained in a family's name for at least 7 years, to allow for claims by relatives or heirs. In April 1777, a land survey mentions no building on the property, describing it only as the unclaimed parcel formerly registered to Pruitt, now returned to territorial inventory. This is a very unusual administrative action. If it weren't for the preservation of oral traditions in the area, the Pruitt family may have been completely erased from official records. Stories about the family that disappeared became part of local legend as white settlers in the Ozarks grew in number in the early 19th century. These reports frequently included information not present in the disjointed official records, details that would subsequently be disturbingly correlated with papers that had been concealed. Reverend Silas Whitman, a circuit preacher in the area from 1818 to 1832, documented one such oral tradition. In his personal papers, preserved at the Arkansas Historical Society, Whitman documented stories told to him by early settlers. The old-timers speak of a family that came to the valley before the Revolution. They built their home over an old Indian burial site, despite warnings from a local trapper. The father discovered a cave entrance on their property and began to hear voices calling to him from below. The children were the first to change, becoming silent and strange, with eyes that reflected no light. Then the mother took to walking at night, speaking in tongues no Christian had heard before. The father held out longest, but in the end he too was taken by what lived beneath the earth. When a trader found the homestead, the family was gone, but something wearing their skins remained for a time. The militiamen who went to investigate never returned to the fort. A larger party was sent, and they found the house empty, but for strange markings carved everywhere. They burned the place to cleanse it, but it's said that the ground there remains cursed. Nothing will grow, and animals avoid it. Most disturbing is the claim that sometimes travelers report seeing children playing near the ruins in the twilight. Children with eyes that reflect no light, who invite passers-by to come below and meet the family. Those who follow are never seen again. Wittmann wrote that after first dismissing these stories as frontier superstition, he started to worry about their regularity among seemingly unrelated villages. I have heard essentially the same narrative, with only minor variations, from settlers in locations 50 miles apart who claim no knowledge of each other, he stated. This suggests either an underlying factual basis or a remarkably widespread transmission of folklore in a region not known for easy communication between isolated communities. The first academic to make a thorough examination of the Pruitt episode was William Porter, a historian from St. Louis in 1841. References to the Pruitt tragedy in early territorial authorities' communications caught his attention. Porter's notes on the subject, which are partially housed in the Missouri Historical Society, describe his methodical method for unraveling the enigma. Having encountered multiple references to the Pruitt incident in the correspondence of Claude Fontaine, I have undertaken to determine the facts of this matter. Initial inquiries with the Territorial Archives yielded little information, with several documents noted in inventory lists mysteriously absent from their expected locations. This pattern of missing documentation is itself noteworthy. I have identified descendants of Jean-Baptiste Duval living near St. Genevieve and hope to determine if any family papers might contain additional information about his encounter with the Pruitt homestead. I have also located church records from the period that may contain information about the family prior to their disappearance. Porter's ensuing notes show growing dissatisfaction with his study. My request to examine the sealed portion of the Fontaine correspondence has been denied without explanation. Similarly, military records from Fort Charlesworth for the period in question are reportedly lost. I find it difficult to believe that documentation from multiple sources would be simultaneously unavailable unless some effort has been made to restrict access. More troubling is the reaction I have received from certain officials when making these inquiries. The territorial archivist, upon hearing the name, visibly paled and informed me that no such records existed, despite my having seen references in indexes. A retired military officer suggested I would be wise to leave Sleeping Dogs Lie and find another subject for historical research. Porter persevered in spite of these challenges, consulting unofficial sources such church records, local folklore, and the private documents of frontier households. A notebook written by Elizabeth Carver, the wife of a militiaman assigned at Fort Charlesworth in 1777, provided him with his breakthrough. On the 20th of February in that year, she stated, "James has returned from the expedition to the Pruitt place, much altered. He will not speak of what they found there, but he wakes screaming in the night. He has taken to examining the floor of our cabin and listening at the walls. Yesterday, I found him carving strange marks into the support beams, similar to those Dr. Hartford discovered on the body of Jenkins when they brought him back. James claims no memory of doing this. Dr. Hartford confided in me that Jenkins died not from any wound or illness he could identify, but rather as if life simply departed from his body over the course of several days. Before the end, Jenkins spoke repeatedly of those who wait below and the replacement that must occur. James refuses to discuss Jenkins or Scherer, changing the subject whenever they are mentioned. the fact that at least one of the militiamen, Thomas Jenkins, did return after the original investigation, but perished under strange circumstances, is first documented in this diary entry. The odd markings, the allusions to those who wait below, and the idea of replacement are also introduced. These would later become recurrent themes in the Pruitt mystery. According to Porter's research notes, he tracked down and spoke with the relatives of James Harlow, the militia corporal who was reported as deserted. Met today with Jacob Harlow, great-grandson of Corporal James Harlow. According to family lore, Harlow did not desert, but returned from his mission in a state of severe mental disturbance. He was confined to an outbuilding on the family farm, after he attempted to lead his children to a cave he had discovered nearby, telling them that the family below wished to meet them. According to Jacob, his ancestor spent his final weeks carving symbols into the walls of his confinement and speaking in multiple voices, including those of children. Before his death, he reportedly told his wife, "They look like us. They sound like us, but they are not us. They are patient, so patient. They have always been here, waiting beneath." Jacob claims that the outbuilding was destroyed. When I inquired whether any record of the symbols remained, he produced a small leather pouch containing a piece of wood, approximately 4 inches square, with markings carved into its surface. He permitted me to make a drawing but refused to part with the artifact, stating that family tradition held that the mark must stay with the blood or misfortune would follow. A circle of interwoven symbols that resemble stylized human beings surrounds what looks to be a picture of a cave or tunnel entrance in Porter's drawing of the wooden artifact. Porter, who was probably unaware of such archaeological discoveries, did not notice the resemblance of these symbols to prehistoric rock art discovered in several Ozark cave systems, but this would be identified by other researchers. A sealed letter from Claude Fontaine to his supervisor dated March 10, 1777, which Porter found in Fontaine's granddaughter's personal collection, was the most illuminating item he found. "I write to you in strictest confidence regarding the matter of the Pruitt homestead and the subsequent investigations. I believe we have done what is necessary in destroying the dwelling and expunging the related documents from official records, but I remain deeply troubled by what we discovered. The testimony of Jenkins before his death, combined with the evidence found at the site, suggests something beyond ordinary human comprehension. The markings found throughout the dwelling match those discovered in the deeper chambers of the cave system behind the homestead, markings that Dr. Montrose's expedition documented last summer and attributed to an ancient indigenous civilization. Most disturbing were the items discovered in the root cellar, which appeared to have been deliberately constructed over a natural shaft leading to the cave system below. The cloth pouches containing human remains of varying antiquity suggest that whatever influence affected the Pruitt family has been present in that location for generations, perhaps centuries. Jenkins spoke of seeing the missing militiamen, Harlow and Scherer, in the caves below the homestead, but claimed they were no longer themselves. His description of their behavior and appearance before his escape matches what the traitor Duval reported about the Pruitt children. A perfect stillness, unnatural smiles, and eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I believe we have contained the immediate threat by sealing the most accessible cave entrances and removing all record of the Pruitt claim from official documents. However, I cannot shake the conviction that we have merely postponed rather than prevented a recurrence. The limestone formations in that region are riddled with passages, many too narrow for adult human entry, but perhaps navigable by children or smaller individuals. I recommend that no further settlement be permitted within 5 miles of the original Pruitt claim, under the pretext of uncertain land titles or military reservation if necessary. Furthermore, I suggest that any reports of unusual behavior or disappearances in the broader region be brought to our immediate attention rather than processed through standard administrative channels. What we are dealing with, I fear, is not a singular tragedy, but the discovery of something that has existed alongside human settlement for untold generations. Something that waits, watches, and occasionally reaches out to claim those who venture too close to its domain. This letter is the earliest known proof of an official cover-up of the Pruitt incident, mentioning the purposeful suppression of information and the closure of cave entrances. It also presents the idea that the family's fate was linked to an ancient phenomenon that existed before they arrived. Porter's last journal entry, from October 15, 1841, shows how much his studies affected him. I now understand why this matter has been systematically obscured. What occurred in that valley was not merely a tragedy, but something that challenges our understanding of human nature itself. The patterns I've discerned across decades of incidents in that region suggest an influence that persists beyond the original event, manifesting whenever human habitation encroaches upon certain underground spaces. I have decided to abandon this research and destroy my notes. The knowledge I have accumulated feels dangerous, not merely to my academic reputation, but to my fundamental well-being. Since examining the Harlow artifact, I have experienced increasing disturbances in my sleep and moments of dissociation during waking hours. I find myself drawn to the walls of my study with an inexplicable urge to recreate the symbols I have seen. Most troubling, I have begun to hear sounds emanating from beneath the floorboards of my home, sounds that my wife and servants cannot detect. A rhythmic pulsing, like a heartbeat, but somehow wrong. The same sound described by Nathaniel Pruitt in his journal. I believe the authorities were correct in their decision to conceal these events. Some knowledge is too dangerous to preserve. The following week, a fire at Porter's house apparently destroyed his study materials. Despite his survival, he never again mentioned or wrote about the Pruitt family. He would apparently get physically unwell when colleagues questioned him and refused to talk about it. His formerly bright academic career was abandoned when he passed away 3 years later. Outside of local mythology, the Pruitt incident was mostly forgotten for almost 80 years after Porter's investigation. But starting in the middle of the 19th century, a trend of related occurrences in the same area started to take shape. Incidents that would ultimately bring the initial mystery back into the spotlight of academics. A family named Collins settled around 10 miles from the original Pruitt homestead, according to court documents dated 1847. Within months, the family's 4 children were exhibiting strange behaviors, such as prolonged silences, speaking in unison, and spending hours standing still in their yard and staring at the ground, according to neighbors. Upon conducting an investigation, local officials discovered walls covered in graffiti resembling those reported in the suppressed colonial reports, as well as appearance in a catatonic state. The 6 family members were committed to an asylum in St. Louis, where they passed away within a year, without ever offering a convincing explanation for what had happened. The children allegedly informed investigators that the people under the floor had commanded them to get ready for the replacement. Parts of the extensive records that Dr. Frederick Schaefer, the asylum's attending physician, kept on the Collins family were found when the old asylum building was renovated in 1962. The Collins children present a most unusual case of shared delusion or folie à famille. All 4, ranging in age from 6 to 13 years, maintain an identical narrative regarding entities they claim exist beneath their former home. They describe these beings as resembling humans but possessing qualities that mark them as other, eyes that absorb rather than reflect light, movements too fluid to be natural, and voices that seem to bypass the ears and manifest directly in the mind. Most disturbing is their consistent claim that these entities are gradually replacing humans in the region, beginning with isolated families. When asked to elaborate on this process of replacement, the children become agitated and begin carving symbols into any available surface, symbols that bear a striking resemblance to those documented in cases of religious mania, despite the children having no apparent exposure to such materials. The parents remain unresponsive to treatment, exhibiting a profound catatonia interrupted only by periods of glossolalia. During these episodes, they speak in what linguistic experts identify as a mixture of languages, including elements of Osage and other indigenous dialects, interspersed with what appears to be a language unknown to current scholarship. Physical examination reveals unusual markings on all family members. Patterns of small, perfectly circular lesions, approximately 1/4 inch in diameter, arranged in geometric configurations on the upper back, shoulders, and base of the skull. These lesions do not appear to be the result of any known disease process or physical trauma. Dr. Schaefer's notes end with a troubling observation. I am forced to consider whether the Collins family's condition might result from environmental factors specific to their settlement location rather than purely psychological causes. The geographical proximity to the site of the infamous Pruitt incident of 1776, which I had previously dismissed as frontier mythology, now strikes me as potentially significant. I have written to the Missouri Historical Society requesting access to any documentation of the earlier case for comparative study. Schaefer's question was never answered, and the Collins case is not mentioned again in any of his later medical writings. But according to asylum documents, Dr. Schaefer took a long leave of absence after the last Collins family member passed away, claiming health issues. He never went back to work and is said to have moved to Boston, where he gave up practicing psychiatry to pursue botanical research. The same pattern of behavioral changes, enigmatic markings, and references to things beneath the earth was seen in similar cases documented in 1879, 1904, and 1936, all within the same geographic area. Official investigations in each case ended with either a conclusion of mass suicide or murder-suicide, or the committing of survivors to institutions. Despite discrepancies that confused investigators, alternative explanations were not considered in official records. The Whitaker family, who bought land about 15 miles from the original Pruitt homestead, was at the center of the 1879 dispute. Church records from the period include a letter from the local pastor to his bishop expressing concern about the family. The Whitaker children have not attended Sunday school for 3 weeks. Upon visiting the family, I discovered a troubling transformation in their demeanor. These previously lively and inquisitive young people now sit in perfect stillness, speaking only when directly addressed, and then in a manner that seems rehearsed. Mrs. Whitaker appears heavily sedated, though she denies taking any medication. Mr. Whitaker was not present, reportedly engaged in improvements to the root cellar. Most disturbing was my discovery of unusual markings carved into the underside of their furniture and the back of religious paintings, symbols of a kind I have never encountered, certainly not Christian in nature. When I inquired about these markings, the eldest daughter, Mary, age 12, informed me that those below required them for the preparation. When pressed on what she meant, she smiled in a manner I can only describe as predatory. I fear some unwholesome influence has taken hold of this family and request guidance on how to proceed with pastoral care in this troubling situation. There is no documentation of the bishop's answer. According to local newspaper archives, a lantern that was toppled during a family argument is said to have caused the Whitaker family's home to burn down 2 weeks after the date of this letter. Although there is no mention of Whitaker interment in historical cemetery records, it was reported that the remains of every family member had been found and interred in the church cemetery. Because it occurred at a time when rural villages were receiving more newspaper attention, the 1904 case has more documentation. In order to develop a self-sufficient farm, the Miller family, John, his wife Eleanor, and their 3 children, had moved from Chicago to a remote Ozarks property. Concerned neighbors who had not seen the family for more than a week summoned local authorities to the residence 6 months after they arrived. The Jefferson County Gazette reported on October 12, 1904, "Family tragedy in remote settlement. Sheriff's deputies made a grim discovery yesterday at the Miller homestead, where all 5 family members were found deceased under bizarre circumstances. According to Sheriff Wilson, the family appeared to have been dead for several days, though no signs of violence or to struggle were evident. It's the strangest case I've encountered in 15 years of law enforcement," Wilson stated. The family was seated at their dining table as if taking a meal, but there was no food present. The positions appeared peaceful, with no indication of distress. Medical examiner Dr. James Harrison has ordered the bodies transported to St. Louis for further examination, as the cause of death could not be determined at the scene. Neighbors reported that the Miller family had become increasingly reclusive in recent months, with the children withdrawn from the local school in September. Of particular note were extensive modifications to the property discovered during the investigation, including an elaborately expanded root cellar with multiple chambers extending into the limestone formation behind the home. Deputies reported unusual markings throughout the dwelling, which Sheriff Wilson declined to describe in detail. The medical examiner's conclusion that the cause of death was consumption of a poisonous fungal substance, likely mistaken for edible mushrooms, was reported in a follow-up article a week later. However, this conclusion did not address why no evidence of the poison was discovered in the home, or why the family would have stayed at the table while the poison took effect. A 1965 study on early law enforcement in the Ozarks uncovered a more illuminating personal letter from Deputy Samuel Jenkins to his brother. "I cannot shake the memory of what we found at the Miller place. The official report mentions the family seated at the table, but it doesn't capture the wrongness of the scene. They were too still, arranged too perfectly, and their expressions not peaceful as the sheriff claimed, but empty, as if something essential had been extracted from them. The markings we found weren't simple graffiti or religious symbols. They covered every surface: walls, ceilings, floors, even carved into the family's furniture and etched onto their silverware. Intricate patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. The longer I studied them, the more I felt they were studying me in return. But it was the root cellar that truly disturbs my sleep. The official report mentions modifications, but doesn't explain that the family had excavated a passage extending at least 30 feet into the limestone bluff behind their home. At the terminus of this passage was a vertical shaft descending into darkness. We could not determine its depth, as dropped torches were extinguished before reaching bottom. Near this shaft, we discovered a journal belonging to John Miller. The entries from their first months were ordinary accounts of farm establishment, but beginning in August, they took a troubling turn. Miller wrote of hearing sounds emanating from the bluff at night. Voices without words, he called them. He described his children becoming fascinated with the limestone formation, spending hours pressing their ears to the rock face. The final entries document Miller's discovery of the cave entrance and his initial exploration. He described finding evidence of previous habitation of great antiquity and markings identical to those my children have begun drawing without ever having seen them. The last coherent entry, dated October 1st, reads, "They are not speaking to us. They are speaking through us. I fear we have become vessels for something that has waited in darkness for generations." The sheriff ordered the journal burned after reading it. He also commanded us never to speak of the shaft or the markings, instructing the medical examiner to find a plausible natural cause for the deaths. When I questioned this decision, he took me aside and told me that similar cases had occurred in the region before, and that official policy was to prevent panic and preserve property values. I handed in my badge the following week. I cannot serve in an office that conceals truth, particularly when I suspect that concealment may enable future tragedies. I write this account so that some record of what really happened may survive. According to reports, Deputy Jenkins moved to Oklahoma soon after resigning from Missouri. Later, researchers failed in their attempts to find him or his descendants. The 1936 case, which concerned a family named Larson, who had just moved from Chicago to a rural Ozarks farm, is especially well documented. In fact, the father, Edward Larson, was a journalist who had traveled to the area to conduct research for a book on historical disappearances. About 2 months after the family started making improvements to their land, which included enlarging the root cellar of their house, the neighbors noticed a significant change in the family's conduct. Larson killed his wife and 2 children before killing himself, according to the final police report. But responding officers pointed out contradictions they were unable to explain. Although they were dead, the family was discovered sitting at their dining table with no obvious wounds. Researchers are still unable to access the sealed autopsy results due to a court order. They were sitting there like they were frozen in time, all of them staring at the same spot on the floor. Their faces didn't look right, like they were stretched somehow. And the markings all over the walls. I don't know what language that was, but it wasn't English. The root cellar door was open. None of us would go down there after what Jenkins saw. However, the sheriff's deputy who initially entered the house made the most noteworthy statement. The next week, he reportedly fled the state after resigning from the sheriff's office. In the 1960s, scholars made fruitless attempts to find him. If not for a pivotal discovery in 1967, the Larson case would have vanished into obscurity like the others that came before it. A sealed box containing orders to destroy it upon her death was found among the belongings of Helen Milner, an old librarian in Springfield, Missouri, during the probate of her estate. The box contained what appeared to be Edward Larson's research materials, including extensive notes on the disappearance of the Pruitt family and other cases similar to it. Instead, the executor, Milner's nephew, decided to look through the contents, a choice he would later refer to as the greatest regret of my life. It is unclear how Milner obtained these materials. The writings Larson kept while living in the Ozarks, which chronicled his family's gradual change, were more unsettling. These journals claimed that Larson had found a system of limestone caverns beneath his land that showed signs of colonial era and indigenous activity. He discovered a metal box filled with documents he thought belonged to Nathaniel Pruitt, including intricate drawings of symbols and what seemed to be ritual instructions. Larson's notebook offers the most thorough, first-hand description of the development of symptoms related to what he eventually dubbed the replacement. On March 15, 1936, "We've been in the house 2 weeks now, and I've established my research office in the small bedroom at the back. Marion and the children are settling in well, though they find the isolation challenging after Chicago. I've begun organizing my notes on disappearances in the region, focusing particularly on the Pruitt case. The similarities across incidents separated by decades are striking. Families in isolated settings, behavioral changes in children, references to voices or entities below, and the recurring motif of replacement." March 30, 1936. Remarkable discovery today. While excavating to expand the root cellar, I broke through into what appears to be a natural cave system. The opening is narrow but navigable. Initial exploration reveals a chamber approximately 15 feet in diameter, with several smaller passages leading deeper. Evidence of previous human activity includes tool marks on the walls and what appear to be very old fire pits. Most intriguing are markings carved into the stone, symbols similar to those described in accounts of the Pruitt incident. On this date in 1936, I've penetrated perhaps 50 yards into the cave system. The passages are complex, with many branches and levels. In a chamber approximately 30 feet below the surface, I discovered a metal box of colonial-era manufacture, badly corroded but intact. Inside were papers and a small leather-bound journal that I believe belonged to Nathaniel Pruitt. The handwriting matches the sample I obtained from Virginia records. The journal contains drawings of symbols identical to those carved in the cave walls, along with text that appears to be instructions of some kind, though the purpose is unclear. On April 18, 1936, Emily mentioned hearing singing from the walls last night. When I pressed her for details, she described it as voices without words. The description matches accounts from previous cases almost verbatim, though I have never discussed my research with the children. Michael has become fascinated with the root cellar door, sitting before it for hours. Marion suggests it's merely childhood curiosity about my work there, but I find myself troubled by the intensity of his focus. On April 25, 1936, Marion discovered unusual markings on Emily's back this morning. Small, circular lesions arranged in a geometric pattern. Emily claims no knowledge of how they appeared and reports no discomfort. The pattern matches a symbol from the cave walls. I have not told Marion of this correlation. Michael has begun drawing compulsively, always the same interconnected symbols, identical to those in the Pruitt journal. When asked where he saw these designs, he replies only, "The people under the floor showed me." On May 3, 1936, the children have become increasingly synchronized in their movements and speech, often completing each other's sentences or speaking in unison without apparent awareness of doing so. They spend hours in whispered conversation that ceases when adults approach. Marion reports hearing sounds from beneath the floor at night. A rhythmic pulsing she describes as like a heartbeat, but wrong somehow. I have not told her this precisely matches Nathaniel Pruitt's description from 1776. On May 12, 1936, I have begun to hear the sounds as well. They are most pronounced near the cave entrance, but seem to permeate the entire house at night. The children now speak of those who wait below and the preparation that must occur. Marion has developed markings similar to Emily's. I have found myself carving symbols into the underside of furniture without conscious intention. The compulsion is difficult to resist. On the 20th of May, 1936, Marion no longer sleeps. She stands at the foot of our bed, watching me with an expression I cannot interpret. The children speak to me in voices that are not their own, explaining that what waits beneath has always been here, long before the first settlers, before the indigenous peoples. They have shown me the markings I must create for the replacement to occur. I understand now why the Pruitt incident was hidden, why all the others were obscured. Such knowledge is too dangerous. May 21st, 1936. They are in the house now. I see them moving behind my children's eyes. Marion no longer speaks, only smiles. The children tell me what waits beneath has been patient for centuries, gradually expanding its influence. They speak of other sites, other families, a slow and methodical process of replacement that has continued undetected. I have failed my family by bringing them here, by pursuing this research. I have delivered them to forces I cannot oppose. I hear them coming up the cellar stairs now. They wear familiar faces, but they are not my family anymore. God forgive me for what I must do. The most thorough description of the development of the replacement from the first symptoms to the end result can be found in this last blog, which was made the day before the family was found dead. After being given to local authorities, Larson's diaries and research materials were quickly forwarded to federal officials. They were kept out of the public eye, just like a lot of other records pertaining to these instances. A few months later, Milner's nephew, who had read the materials before turning them in, had a nervous collapse. Throughout his therapy, he made frequent references to the replacement and drew symbols on his walls that were said to correspond with those Larson wrote about in his notebooks. Some academics theorized a link between these instances and the distinctive geological characteristics of the Ozark region because of their geographic clustering. Numerous limestone cave systems in the region are well known, and some of them include evidence of human habitation that dates back thousands of years. According to indigenous oral traditions, some caves are areas where the line separating realities thins and serve as entryways or barriers between worlds. According to archaeological evidence, numerous indigenous societies in the area utilized some of the region's cave locations for ceremonial purposes long before European settlers arrived. Humanoid images with deformed features and symbols resembling those reported in the Pruitt incident and other incidents are depicted in rock art found in isolated caverns. Anthropologist Margaret Welch studied Ozark folk traditions in 1923, interviewing elder citizens who told stories passed down about the family that disappeared. The recordings, kept at Washington University in St. Louis, were not made public until 1967, when only authorized researchers were allowed to listen to parts of them. In one recording, Joseph Miller, 94, recalled what his grandfather had told him. They didn't just vanish, you understand. They were there, and then they weren't. But they left something behind, something that wasn't them anymore, but wore their faces for a time. That's what the old folks said anyway. That's why they burned the place down. Fire cleanses. Martha Crowley, another elderly resident, mentioned a journal her great-grandmother had kept that included a second-hand account of the incident. The children were found first, all sitting at the table like they were waiting for supper, but they'd been sitting there 3 days, according to the men who found them. Just sitting, not talking, not moving. Their ma and pa were nowhere. When they tried to get the young ones to speak, they just smiled. They didn't eat, didn't drink. And their eyes weren't right. The assertion that the Pruitt children were discovered alive but essentially altered, unresponsive, refusing food and water, but somehow surviving for days before being taken to a church in a nearby settlement, is a significant component introduced by these oral histories that is not specifically mentioned in official documents. Various stories describe what transpired when they arrived to the church, but they all conclude with the edifice burning under strange reasons. There are no official colonial records of this church fire. Anthropologist Catherine Reynolds came up with the most convincing explanation for the Pruitt riddle in a contentious 1965 study that was turned down for publication. According to Reynolds' theory, the Pruitt family unintentionally relocated atop a location that holds ceremonial importance for indigenous cultures, possibly one connected to collective ritual or altered states of consciousness. The combination of geological features, potential environmental contaminants such as fungal spores common in cave systems, and the psychological stresses of frontier isolation could explain the pattern of psychological deterioration observed in these cases, Reynolds stated. Indigenous knowledge of these effects may be reflected in traditional warnings about certain cave systems being doorways to other worlds or realms of non-human entities. Reynolds proposed that exposure to some environmental toxins, especially fungal spores known to have psychoactive qualities, was consistent with the symptoms reported in several cases: auditory hallucinations, compulsive symbol making, synchronization of behavior, and the feeling of being influenced or possessed by outside forces. The limestone cave systems of the Ozarks create ideal conditions for certain fungal species that produce compounds similar to ergot alkaloids, which have been linked to historical cases of mass psychosis. The discovery of a 1947 geological survey that found unusual mineral deposits in cave systems close to the assumed site of the Pruitt homestead, deposits containing elevated levels of arsenic, mercury, and other elements known to cause neurological symptoms when exposure occurs over time, was what really strengthened Reynolds' theory. The persistence of similar symptoms across centuries suggests a constant environmental factor, rather than a transmissible pathogen or cultural phenomenon, she said. The combination of psychoactive fungal compounds and low-level heavy metal exposure could produce the exact constellation of symptoms described in these cases. Reynolds said, "The progression from auditory hallucinations to visual phenomena to behavioral changes and ultimately to catatonia or death follows a predictable neurotoxicological pattern." Reynolds was unable to obtain funds for a thorough investigation of the region. Reynolds, like many others before her, reported having unsettling dreams and feeling that she was being watched, which led her to eventually give up on her studies. After she persisted in solving the Pruitt mystery, her academic career took a hit, and she eventually quit anthropology completely to become a high school teacher in Arizona. In 1952, a family of 4 vanished from their newly acquired farmhouse about 15 miles from the original Pruitt homestead, marking the last recorded instance that fits the pattern set by the Pruitt case. Due to abandonment following the revelation that the property was situated over an unstable cave system, the matter at the time got minimal attention. The property has been vacant ever since no bodies were discovered. The background of the family patriarch, Dr. Richard Conley, a geologist who specialized in karst formations and had traveled to the Ozarks especially to research the area's cave systems, is what made this last case so noteworthy. Before going missing, Conley wrote a number of scholarly articles about odd mineral formations in limestone caverns and how they can affect groundwater. In his final paper, which was published in January 1952, Conley, "Certain cave systems in the western Ozark region exhibit mineral compositions unlike any documented elsewhere in North America. Of particular interest are deposits containing compounds that, when subjected to the specific temperature and humidity conditions common to these environments, may release airborne particulate with potential neurological effects. Historical accounts of unusual psychological phenomena associated with these cave systems may have a basis in these environmental exposures, rather than in the supernatural explanations often attributed to them." Conley moved his family to the area of the original Pruitt homestead 3 months after this publication was published in order to carry out on-site research. There were no more scholarly works published under his name. Authorities discovered the house undamaged but empty, with a lunch spread out on the table, when they looked into the family's disappearance in June 1952. This site was uncannily similar to the Pruitt event. The finding of Conley's field notebook, which detailed his investigation of a cave system reachable via the root cellar on the property, was more unsettling. His choice to gather samples for study and his observation of odd growth patterns in fungal forms close to mineral deposits are detailed in the final entries. After going into the caverns with him on multiple occasions, he observed that his kids had started to show signs of increased sensory awareness, such as the capacity to communicate nonverbally and navigate flawlessly in complete darkness. The final note, which was written on June 3, 1952, "They have always been here. Not a contamination, but a communion. The children understand already. Susan is beginning to accept. I am the last to comprehend what we are becoming. The replacement is not an end, but a transformation. According to county documents, a local historical preservation organization bought a sizable piece of land that included this property, as well as the alleged site of the first Pruitt homestead after this tragedy. Although environmental conservation was the stated goal, no research or development has been allowed in the region since. Journalists and researchers have often been denied access to these sites. A local historian interviewed the last known descendant of one of the 3 militiamen who disappeared during an investigation into the original Pruitt homestead in 1959. The old lady related a family legend that had been passed down through the generations. Her ancestor had not vanished, but had returned changed, referring to the family beneath and the replacement that must occur. Family legend states that he was confined to an outbuilding on the family farm, where he wrote symbols on the walls and spoke in voices other than his own until he passed away 3 weeks later. According to reports, he said to his wife before he passed away, "They sound and look like us, but they are not us. And they are patient, so patient. They have always been here, waiting beneath. The Pruitts were just the beginning." This claim, which is supported by several separate decades-old reports, points to a continuity of experience that defies simple explanation as coincidence or folklore. It suggests that there is something enduring there, something that watches, waits, and even reaches out to seize people who approach its territory too closely. In 1968, while remodeling the county courthouse in Jasper County, Missouri, workmen found a metal box in a concealed compartment inside a wall. It contained a number of late 18th century documents, including what seemed to be a partly government report on the Pruitt incident. A French colonial official's report detailed discoveries at the property that went against the disappearance story. Physical evidence, according to this paper, indicated that the family had exhibited strange behavior in the weeks preceding the occurrence. The patterns had been carved into the cabin's walls, concealed by hangings and furniture. Investigators uncovered tiny cloth bags containing human teeth, hair, and bone fragments beneath the floorboards. Some of the pouches seem to have been located on the site decades before the Pruitt family arrived. The description of the root basement was the most unsettling. According to the documents, investigation showed that the cellar had been purposefully built over what looked to be a naturally occurring limestone cave entrance. Markings resembling those in the cabin were carved into the stone walls of the cave, indicating much older human occupation. According to the colonial official's testimony, the Pruitt family had not disappeared, but had instead left the area after waking something that had been sleeping under their house for a long time. Although this document was given to the Missouri Historical Society, a 1969 federal order prohibited it from being viewed by the general public. Despite the declared justification of historical preservation concerns, researchers who attempted to gain access were turned away without providing an explanation. Anthropologist Robert Chambers oversaw an archaeological dig near the Pruitt homestead's alleged location in 1968. According to the field notes of the trip, they uncovered traces of a stone-filled root cellar and the burnt foundation of a big cabin. After 3 crew members reported experiencing severe psychological anguish, including auditory hallucinations and frightening nightmares, efforts to excavate the cellar were abandoned. Given these circumstances, Chambers' final report was remarkably circumspect, stating only that the site appears to have cultural significance beyond its colonial-era occupation, with evidence suggesting prior indigenous use of a complex of natural caves beneath the homestead location. Further investigation is not recommended due to structural instability. The dreams began after we uncovered the entrance to the cave system. Always the same. Children sitting around a table, silent, watching. Behind them, something moves in the darkness, something that has been waiting. More concerning was what Chambers did not include in his official report, but confided to a colleague in correspondence later found among his personal effects after his death in 1976. The local workers refused to continue after Thomas discovered the markings. They match what was described in the 1777 report exactly, though we hadn't disclosed those details to the team. How could they have known what to carve into the support beams? And the children's voices at night, calling from the darkness, calling our names. The excavation was officially ended due to budgetary constraints. The site was backfilled, and no marker was placed to indicate its historical significance. Chambers never went back to archaeology. Instead, he taught at a tiny college and avoided doing any more research on colonial settlements in the Ozarks. Folklorist Ellen Rutledge started gathering tales from the descendants of the area's first residents in 1973. Her investigation revealed a recurring theme in regional folklore: the Pruitt Warning, a collection of signs allegedly pointing to a recurrence of whatever occurred to the original family. Unusual burn-like marks on the skin, youngsters talking to invisible beings, strange silence in the forest, and the urge to make or copy specific symbols were some of these warning signs. Never build a dwelling with a root cellar near limestone formations. If children begin speaking in unison or show unusual interest in the ground, relocate immediately. Burn any objects marked with the symbols. Never touch them directly. If family members develop small circular marks on their skin, separation must be immediate and complete, she wrote down, citing oral traditions that suggest some preventative measures could prevent the replacement if implemented early enough. These generation-to-generation folk warnings imply a cultural recollection of real-life occurrences rather than merely fantastical supernatural stories. When it comes to recording the development of local mythology around the Pruitt incident and incidents like it, Rutledge's work is very helpful. A common experiential base is suggested by the precision of the symptoms described and their consistency across reports from various families and historical periods. In addition to the horror of what happened to one family, the Pruitt mystery's enduring power comes from the suggestion that it is only one example of a process that goes on beneath the surface of recorded history, claiming isolated families over many generations while eluding official inquiry. One of the most important aspects of the mystery is the pattern of official suppression. From the sealing of documents to the burning of the original homestead, from the career consequences for those who sought the truth to the psychological toll reported by researchers, a distinct pattern of institutional resistance to any thorough investigation becomes apparent. This pattern of repression begs the question: why the remarkable attempts to keep these cases out of the historical record if they were only frontier tragedies caused by isolation, mental illness, or environmental factors? What information was considered too risky to keep? Most troubling of all, why keep the secret after so many decades if the pattern has actually stopped? The truth about the Pruitt family lies in the thick forests of the Ozark Mountains, where ghostly fingers of mist cling to old trees, a fact that was methodically obliterated from history but that persisted in rumors, textual fragments, and the unfathomable terror that overtakes anyone who attempts to solve this enigma. The Pruitt family's ancestral land has mainly stayed unaltered. Hunters and hikers steer clear of the region, citing the impression of being watched and the odd silence. Because of the risky sinkholes and precarious cave systems, local guides won't take parties there. The region's government maps display odd blank areas where comprehensive topographical data ought to be. Additionally, locals who continue to issue warnings say that occasionally kids disappear in those forests. Days later, they return, physically unhurt but in some ways quieter and changed. They create symbols on the walls of their bedrooms, listen to the floors at night, and talk about playing with other children beneath the earth, and adults with stretched smiles who taught them songs without words. It appears that the replacement goes on, slowly, with patience, one individual at a time. What is beneath the Ozark Hills is still slowly making its way into our world, and the portal that the Pruitt family unintentionally opened is still open. The actual horror of the Pruitt mystery may lie not in what happened to a single family in 1776, but rather in what started with them, a process that is now going on in quiet and darkness, weighed down by institutional denial and systemic suppression. A process that might perhaps be coming to an end right now. The truth is still hidden, in closed records, in caves that have collapsed, in the thoughts of those who saw the pattern and decided to keep quiet rather than go insane. However, once established patterns tend to repeat themselves, and once a door is opened, it cannot be closed. Something lurks in the Ozark Mountains' thick forests, where mist clings to old trees like ghostly fingers. Something that talks with borrowed voices and dawns looks it knows. Something with centuries of patience. It is still hungry too,